Me. I'm really excited about this session. My name is Tim Fawns. I work at the Monash Education Academy in Monash University, Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Before I go any further, I'd like to pay my respects to the people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the unceded lands from where I'm speaking. Pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. At Monash, we had a conversation this week. We're calling them challenge space conversations, and they are conversations that we hold around questions that we don't have good answers for. So it's a funny time, isn't it? And a lot of people are looking for answers and guidance. And in a lot of cases, we don't have very clear guidance. We're still figuring it out. And so these challenge conversations are just holding a place to say we don't know, but we're happy to kind of talk it through, and we take questions from the community. And on Tuesday, we had one that was on the topic of how can we respect Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous voices while trying to address the challenges of generative artificial intelligence in education. And it was such a fantastic conversation. And when we have the recording, I'll share it with the community because it's well worth a watch. It touched on a lot of different elements of inclusion and digital divides and how to navigate this context of artificial intelligence and what it means to try to do that while respecting different types of knowledges and different perspectives. And so one of the insights that came out of that conversation was the value of taking things a bit slower, this sense of urgency that we have all the time, especially since generative artificial intelligence became widely available 2.5 years ago. And so I wanted to try and slow things down a little bit. You know, our urgency to try and respond to the challenge of assuring learning at a time of widely available GenAI, it makes us rush things and we can kind of forget what matters. And the other thing I wanted to do was I wanted to do a little bit of co-design with you. So I am going to share my screen and talk you through a story, but I want you to help me with the story. And so I'm posting a link in the chat to my Google Slides that I'm going to use. And I want you to be in that document with me, and I want you to annotate those notes as I go, putting your thoughts in. So I've got a kind of a story framework, a story arc, but I want you to mess it up, and I want you to put your thoughts into there. I want you to contextualize these kind of vague and aspirational things that I have to say. And because this is a messy space, and I have to say at the start, I don't have all the answers that you want, and this is my way of seeing making learning visible in a time of Gen AI, and some of it might you might struggle with, and I want to know that. And I would love for you to put it in the slides or the chat. I love chat. Or you can interrupt me, maybe put up the hand icon if you know how to do that, or a physical hand if you're prepared to do that, and I will bring you in. And all the while, I will try to seamlessly guide it into the time scale that we have allocated for today. So I'm going to start doing this convoluted sharing thing. Please give me a thumbs up, Jenny, if you can see the slides in your sharing. The good thing about the way I'm doing it is I can still see people's faces. I can still see the chat while I'm going through my slides. And I can even see the rest of my slides, because sometimes I get trapped in Zoom or Teams and I can't see anything except my slides. But I've found a way forward, and I'm pretty happy about that. So the first slide that I go on to, or slide number 2, is how are you feeling right now? So either in the chat if you prefer, or on the slide using a text box, which I think you can, there's a button there that says a big T and a little t. If you click that, it'll make a text box, or copy the one that I've got that says cold. How are you feeling right now? Just stick some words in there that let us know how you feel at the moment. Part of the value of this is just to get you typing in the slides, because that's what I really want as we go forward. And part of it is because I do care about how you're feeling. And I think how we're taking stock of how we're feeling is actually quite an important thing to do. Maybe stick a name or initials on the end of the things that you're typing so I know who it is that's sleepy. The slides, you can be anonymous in the slides if you want, but I think it will help the conversation if we know who's tired, sleepy. I put cold. I should have put excited. This is such a fun thing for me to do. Such a lovely community, MyFest, and great minds to kind of think with. Oops, I've lost my chat then. Okay, so Yasmin is driving, so that's fine. Don't crash. Happy to be here, but sleepy. Fantastic. Good use of emoji. I'm going to put in something about. All right. The next thing I want to do is possibly more difficult. But I think if we're going to get through this session with getting something out of it, we need to be prepared to put stuff in. And I want to build a little bit of energy and courage and vulnerability first. So for the next 30 seconds, if you put your mic on mute and your video off, hopefully we'll turn them back on in a second for those who are happy. And I want you to spend 30 seconds making bizarre and uninhibited movements and shouting. So I might shout something like, I don't know what I'm doing. You might want to build confidence and shout, I do know what I'm doing, or shout something else. But just, you've got 30 seconds to just free yourself, scream if you want, jump around, get moving. Any movement that you can do is fine. Right. I don't know if that was 30 seconds. It's hard to sustain that level of activity. So who wants to say what they did or type it in the chat or the slides? I did some star jumps and I yelled some random noises. What did you do?
I'll go. I stretch, you know that, but like it's called a morning stretch where you do like arms as long as you can go, legs as long as you can go. Because that just feels really nice. So I did that and then I did and I tried to sort of jump up from that.
What did you do, Irene?
I screamed internally because if I scream here, my neighbors will come. I work from home. So I screamed from internally and I felt it, and I also did quite a bit of stretching.
Excellent. Jim, what did you do? Jim may or may not be able to speak. Oh, Yasmin, Nadeem, Susan.
I actually I beat the car.
Fantastic. Jim, you must be very confused. We were just letting out some inhibitions or being uninhibited for a minute so that we're all ready to participate going forward. Didn't hear the question. Doesn't matter. People, we were just doing random things with the camera and mic off for 30 seconds just so that we're kind of energized and in the mood, which I hope it worked for you. It worked for me. So now let's get on to the actual business at hand. So I'm going to tell this story, and on each slide I have some questions that I want you to just stick some text boxes down on. So the first thing is I want to talk about the idea of encountering students. And you'll see, like, my concept of making learning visible in a time of GenAI doesn't really involve much locking students in a room and getting them to do the same thing, and making sure they can't use GenAI. It's to do with thinking about how we can know and do know what our students know. That's fine, Jim, no worries. Chat's great. Thanks, Jenny, for adding the slides. So Jim, just to clarify, we're doing this kind of co-designed slide set. So feel free to mess up the slides and stick words on there. So how do we know what our students know? You know, there are some moments when you're teaching students, and maybe you've even done an assessment and it's come back and you've thought, well, they didn't do as well on that assessment as I thought they would, because I know that they know this. And so I kind of want to know, how do you know? When do you know what your students know? How do you know? And what does it mean to meaningfully know and encounter your students during a course? Feel free to come in on the microphones as well. I mean, is this even something that you care about? Do you feel like you get a chance to encounter your students in your current context? So maybe a good thing to do is to quickly go around everybody, either on microphone or chat. What is your teaching context? Who are your students? Do you have students? Are you supporting other people who have students? Who are they? So if you're happy to come in on microphone, that would be great. And otherwise, please stick something in the slides or in the chat. Maybe the chat's a good place to list who your students or who your teachers are, and on voice. Who's brave and wants to go first? Someone is writing in the notes section of the slide deck. That's fine. Do whatever you want. The notes are gone. The notes are gone. I'll go back to. It was fine, Irene. Right in the notes. Right, so Susan says AUC freshman academic English. Okay, they're your students, Susan? Do you feel like you get to encounter them? Do you feel like you get... So Susan's written, yes, they are your students. So on the slides we have Jenny saying, co-create the learning and assessment with them, make it about what we learn, not they. I love that. Nadine says, involve them in designing a meaningful assignment for them. Part of that for me includes giving them a choice and agency. Reflection is also a good one for me to connect with them. Yes. So there's more co-design there. And I think co-design is a powerful way to understand what your students know. And that to me, I want to write down the word involvement, because you've got invigilation, you've got supervision, and you've got involvement. You might have other things too, but involvement to me is where the educator is working with the students on relevant things, and through that collaboration really does get to know quite a lot about what the student knows, probably more than an oral exam or an interview, although that depends, you know, those can be really targeted as well. So Jenny teaches a few modules, undergraduate and postgraduate, and feels like she has all 4,500 students at Manchester as you run the centralized skill support program. Yeah, so that is a lot of students. Students working with you, co-creating, it is amazing. Yep, co-creation is actually a pretty good way of making learning visible, I think, although it depends on any method, it depends how it's done. Yasa says, not currently teaching, interact with lots of faculty and students, see lots of perspectives on assessment. Irene says, I bring myself, the playful and serious me, and get intentional in our co-creation and other engagements. Yeah, it's great. So you all have this sense of what it means to encounter students, and that is a lot for us to work with. So there's issues of trust at the moment, and possibly there have been for a long time in higher education, and the discourse around student cheating, AI detection, invigilation, the impoverished relation, or the perception of impoverished relationships between students and teachers and institutions. It's not true for everyone, thankfully. But I think that underneath it all, if we are to get the trust of students and the trust of educators and the trust of institutions and the trust of society in higher education and education more generally, we do need credible qualifications. We do need people to be able to believe in the qualifications that institutions are handing out. And I think credible qualifications need credible evaluations of credible evidence of learning. So the evidence of learning that is being evaluated, I think that evidence needs to be credible. And I think the way that it is evaluated needs to be credible. And I think sometimes I often pick on invigilated exams, and there can be a place for invigilated exams, but I think they're quite easy for me to pick on because they are often the place that people will go to when they want to assure learning. But how credible is the evidence of learning from an exam? And it depends on the kind of learning that you're trying to target. But I think, for example, a multiple choice exam script that has a set of answers that's been chosen is credible for certain kinds of knowledge and not credible for other kinds of knowledge. And so the way that it is evaluated and what it means speaks to that credibility. In the chat, Jim says, I'm retired, but have frequently been asked to teach skills courses with adult students in small communities, e.g. firearms safety, interpreter students, pre-employment, relating with small groups of students through shared experiences. Sounds pretty interesting. I'd love to hear more about the background. What kind of discipline were you, who were you working for, and that sort of thing, Jim? Okay, so before we started recording, Jenny was talking about lanes, 2-lane assessment, which is a big deal that has been coming out of the University of Sydney in Australia, Danny Liu and Adam Bridgman. And those 2 lanes are essentially secure and open assessments. And in the secure ones, you make sure that students are complying with your restrictions, which might often involve prohibiting AI or being very restrictive about its use, and open assessments where you are less concerned about how students are going about things, and often that will be categorized as formative or assessment for learning, and often the secure will be summative or assessment of learning. But it gets the water gets very muddy because you have places who say, well, we need 50% of our assessment to be secure and 50% can be open, and there's the 2 lanes are being kind of realized and operationalized in very different ways. You also have traffic lights. So a lot of people have come up with different ways of trying to help understand how we might restrict or prohibit or operationalize the student use of AI so that we can know a bit more about what they're learning. And the thing that I come back to is really, you always in assessment, and feel free to disagree with me here, either via mic or chat or by putting things on the slides. So this is just my view, and it's probably quite contentious. I think I might be in the minority, but I think really it's all orange in the sense that except where you really lock down an assessment. So you put people in a room and you prohibit AI, and you probably, that's becoming very difficult with wearable AI to make sure nobody is using any AI whatsoever. With the exception of those quite extreme views, there's often some AI going on. It shouldn't be any AI, because if you let students do whatever they want, then you're really not doing an educational job. The job of education is trying to help students learn things, and that involves asking them to do things in particular ways, structuring what they do in particular ways in order to try and target learning. So there really is no, it doesn't make sense to me to have a free-for-all. Here's a task, do it. I don't care how you do it. Of course you care how students go about doing the task as an educator, because it matters to how they learn. And so you need to place some kind of guidance and restriction on how they do it. You need to engage with how they do it, talk to them about it, give them some feedback. I think it's all one lane for the same reason that you really always need to know what your students are doing if you want to appreciate how they're learning. And I don't mean at all times, I just mean when you are assessing their work, you need to have a sense of how they went about doing the work. And so it doesn't make sense to have either secure or open. It all needs to be secure in the sense that you need to have some kind of sense of how they're going about it and some kind of say in how they go about it. You need to structure the tasks. But as we'll get on to, it gets complicated. And anyone want to interrupt me at that point, having said something contentious?
I don't know if I'm going to say it's contentious. You were reminding me of what Sakina is doing at the University of Cape Town. So they talk about observable learning, to kind of move away from my conversations with them, to kind of move away from the idea that you have to invigilate to be rigorous, you know. And so what they're talking about is that you need to have an understanding and observation of the learning and the process of the learning that's happened. But that observation can happen in a multitude of ways. So it could be peer-led, yeah. It can be lecturer-led, it could be student-led. And then it acknowledges the fact, as you were saying, I think that there will be some AI at some point, almost certainly, if only because things like Grammarly and Word have just dumped it in there, and it's literally impossible to avoid. And so I think I did start wondering actually if when we focus so hard on the policing of the assessment, you know, that rigor only comes through isolation, and we could maybe flip and think actually, well, rigor might come through observation instead, and observation isn't something that has to happen when you're all by yourself in a room. You know, that's not the only way to see what and how someone is learning. So it was less contentious, maybe, and more just a reminder about work that's happening around that.
That's great. It goes nicely to my next slide, which is if I wanted to divide things up, I might divide things into adversarial security measures or non-adversarial assurance measures. So there's a debate going on at the moment about whether assessment security is inherently adversarial, because it involves prevention and detection and punishment, and essentially policing whether students are following the rules or trying to enforce conditions that stop them from stop them from breaching the rules or transgressing policies. But I want to think about this non-adversarial way forward, because I think if we are really serious about education, we need to try and create trusting relationships between students and teachers. And so as far as we can, we want to be non-adversarial. We want to be on the same side as students. We want to be helping them. We want to be with them. So my little notes here are, can we sneak past security by doing things the hard way? And I'll get into what the hard way means, but essentially means doing education in a quite intensive way through which we get to know our students, but through which we also generate evidence of students' learning and capability that we can use to evaluate what it is we want to know about what they're doing. So I said before, education always requires restriction, and it also always requires support, and it involves checking in on students, I think, anyway, if you're doing it well. And so that can be collegial and supportive, and it can also foster a sense of knowing the students, what they're learning and what they can do. So I'll give you just a few, like half a minute, to add any notes onto that slide if you want, or to stick anything in the chat. Nadine is saying, I think also one of the main issues is that because it's so easy, students who aren't intrinsically motivated to truly learn always find ways to use how to go around the structure. Yeah, well, that's probably true. Poses an issue, makes educators feeling like they are either policing or beginning students not to go to AI. You probably mean begging, do you? Even if they redesign their assessments meaningfully. Yeah. So, yeah, no problem. So we get this answer a lot. When I talk about trying to build trust, I get this response often from people that say, well, there's students that will never, that aren't there to learn. And I think that's right. And then there's a question about what do we do about it, and who does it? Because I think if every educator spends a lot of energy working on students who are not there to learn, everyone suffers in a way, because you're spending a lot of energy on those people who are not planning to learn in the first place. If you're at an institution that's privileged enough to have an academic integrity team, then it's quite good if they can take the brunt of the investigations. But then the more evidence that we can generate, the better. And the rigorous way that we might go about generating evidence of learning that is not based on snapshots, but done over time, I think gives us more opportunity to make it difficult for such students, but also to aid in the investigation. So the detection of learning and the detection of the avoidance of learning rather than the detection of cheating is, I think, a more practical way to frame this. So Jenny says, I think we just count how much students want their degree to be rigorous or count. Yeah, I think that's right. We've been doing some research into student perspectives on AI, and we're finding the students we've spoken to are extremely thoughtful about this, and they're very concerned. They want their qualification to mean something, and they want to actually learn something, and they're very willing to get involved and try and help with that. So targeting learning. What kind of learning are we trying to target with assessment? If you don't do this job well of trying to work out what it is you want to target, then you're going to struggle to do a good job of assessment. Where do we get the targeting? Where do we get the learning from? I really want you to list some places that you get your learning from. So maybe you've got a learning outcome that you want us to talk about, or maybe you have theories of learning that matter to you. Maybe you have some educational values that help you understand the type of learning. So let's just take a minute and stick down, quick and dirty, as many as you can in the chat or the slide. What type of learning do you want to target with your assessment? Or if you're supporting other people, what kind of learning do you think they want to target? Or if you don't have such a case, just think of some study that you did, and how did how how did people come up with the types of learning that should be targeted? And if you need examples, we might be thinking of a learning outcome that might be something like, by the end of this, students should be able to think critically about assessment security in higher education. Or it might be that you want them to be part of a community of practice around academic integrity in higher education. So if you can just stick down some thoughts, there's no wrong answers here. These are just things for us to talk about so that we understand what it means to target learning. Because I suspect that sometimes we haven't really been quite clear enough about what it is we're looking for. Learning outcomes are not as specific as we like to think. They can be operationalized in very different ways, and sometimes in ways that we don't think about too much. So Jim is writing about retired from developmental studies with community college, Northern Indigenous community in Canada, just when GPT was appearing. AI use has not been an issue because the courses are practical and ungraded and discussion-based, except firearms, safety, multiple choice exams. Very interested in this conversation because of how it relates to trust. So have you got any learning that you might be able to stick in the chat or on the slide, Jim, that would give us something to talk through? If not, I'm going to use my terrible examples that are less interesting than yours. Or you might like to just say something via the microphone. Anybody? So Jenny is putting in the slide, be able to articulate the process they use to arrive at their conclusions, assertions. Sounds like the type of learning outcome that might feature in any number of different disciplines and topics. And so is there anything that you could use that might not be specified in the learning outcomes that could narrow that down a little bit? Thinking about what they need to learn in order to do that.
I think I almost wrote the word demonstrate instead of articulate. And so I did wonder if there was so thinking about Jim's comment about his teaching being practically based and how powerful that was. I wondered if there was an element, and also about the idea of him being observable, of demonstration of thinking. I think we often demonstrate outcome or, the final thought, right, by a paper or a presentation or something. But we don't often embrace or give time for them demonstrating the process by which they came to that conclusion, unless it's very academically coded, like this is my evidence and this is my, that kind of thing. So I was trying to think of a targeted learning that was around not just the process by which you learn, but like a very narrow one where it's like, no, this is where I got to, and this is how I got there. That is perhaps more holistic, and then perhaps could be more of a demonstration in kind of a practical sense, in thinking about sort of assessment and community and the ways and kinds of things we learn from each other. Because I thought then they won't only be learning about someone's conclusion, which they may agree or disagree with, but also they can learn about how they went about getting there. And that's like a quite powerful secondary element that someone may really benefit from.
Okay, and so the reason to be able to articulate the process, I understand, I think, the reason to be aware of the process. The reason is the articulation just because that demonstrates that they are aware, or is it more than that?
I think it's twofold. So first, when I talk to students about assessments specifically, I tell them often they're not being tested on what they know, they're being tested on how well they communicate what they know. So it's not enough to have memorized a fact. You have to understand the expectations around communicating that understanding and the sort of mode and method that you will then actually be tested on. So articulation is folded into academic expectations around, demonstration of knowledge and things like that. But also, I think that if we ask ourselves to speak to something as opposed to regurgitate or multiple choice something, just answer something. It's a higher level ask. And it's something that, again, can be, as you noted, could be brought into almost or into many, many different places around learning. And I'm not sure that, or at least I have not seen it often specifically assessed in ways that give it weight along with course content. So I think that's where I was thinking with the word articulate. But a lot of it has to do with the communities that I work with and how often, they focus so hard on not memorizing, really understanding, but then they get to a point where they have to show what they know and they've not practiced that. And that can be quite difficult.
We'll probably come back to this learning outcome. One of the reasons that I'm picking on the word articulate, which I think is probably a good word, but sometimes we constrain the task, the assessment task, by the words that we choose in the learning outcome where we don't necessarily need to. So, it's worth having this kind of conversation where you dig into, well, what do we really care about here and why? Have we structured the learning outcome because it aligns with the type of assessment that we usually do in this subject? Or is it something that actually really is important for our students to learn? And I'm not judging that learning outcome in those terms. I'm just, sometimes it's worth digging into the learning outcomes themselves as part of the process of doing this kind of assessment work, because you can open up more possibilities and you can become clear about what it is that you want to target as well. So now we're talking about targeted tasks. So what does the demonstration of the targeted learning look like? So we could pick on Jenny a little bit more, but other people can also add their thoughts in here. And Jim has something on storytelling. So I'm starting to imagine some kind of storytelling related learning outcome that you might want to target as well, Jim. So what would a demonstration of that learning look like, Jenny?
I was just thinking about the word articulate and then how I might have narrowed it by using that word. But I think a demonstration of the ability to communicate what you know would need to be something that, again, showed evidence of, right, an understanding of what was not known to an understanding of what was known. Because for me, it's that growth and the ability to communicate that change that needs assessing from a student perspective and from a lecturer perspective. So I need to be able to see in my students where they were and where they've got to. And more importantly, they need to understand where they were and where they've got to. So I think I think a demonstration of that could be, it could open up a lot of different things. They could either have done a series of reflective storytelling, but you could also, I could see some of the students I work with wanting to test themselves, and demonstrate change that way, and then explain the change that they can show through a test, some kind of test. I could see people comparing, themselves to a standard of some kind and articulating the differences there. So I think there's a lot of ways to demonstrate if what your target is that change. There's a lot of ways to demonstrate that change that again are quite applicable. So I often have these conversations across the university, which may be why my brain they were something that could be used sort of in a lot of places. But I think that would be quite helpful because in both a humanities subject where perhaps you are more guided around, this is how we think together and all that thing, that would work. But also, again, equally in a sort of more practical science or medicine subject where you said, well, no, I didn't know this. And now I can demonstrate I know this because I can do that thing. So it would also leave options for co-creation. So I think it would look like a student articulated task that shows where they can evidence their growth in ways that align with whatever the content is that we're trying to address.
And now my brain is going, thank you. My brain is going to like, could you do a bunch of those in fairly informal way? It doesn't need to be this huge deal. It could be that there are multiple encounters that happen that give them the opportunity to do that articulation work in different ways.
Yeah, I would think so. And also with each other, because one of the most powerful things to learn is that someone else is doing something different than you. Again, in teaching, I showed a picture of my eldest son reading a passport upside down because he knew reading was like you open it up, you sit down and you look at it. But he picked up a passport and he held it upside down. So he was imitating what he thought was happening because he didn't know what was actually happening. So I think it'd be really interesting for them to demonstrate to each other what's actually happening. Yes, just got his hand up.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I also think about the conflated ideas between purpose, because you said a very or perhaps Jenny, a very important sort of aspect, which is like where students were. And I think that has to do with the conflated ideas between purpose and competition, because we have to also acknowledge the fact that education is competitive and students are in competition with getting a grade or getting a specific level of merit to reach something. And when that happens, I think that even when the relationship between students working together is kind of confusing at times, because you don't know where somebody is versus where the other is. In the sense of, if students are in group work and then some person is fluent in digital sort of literacy and somebody is very digital literate versus another student who's not really on the same level. So coming to assess that kind of literacy and coming to reflect on that with the whole group of students working together creates a little bit of disruption, I think, because of that idea of you don't know where students are. And it doesn't mean that you don't know where students are in terms of being faculty. No, I think it might be in terms of being students together as well. Like students, how will they create something together? And in between them, there is a student who's on a higher end of a spectrum and another student who's on another end of the spectrum. And with the rise of AI, we can talk a lot about students using AI in an excessive way versus another student who is not really in favor of using AI. So a part of the writing would be like full of AI, or a part of the project would be full of image generated AI images, but the other part would be full human, and then that creates kind of disruption in assessment later.
These are good points, Yasser, and there's a fairness question that kind of pervades all of this, and I guess it comes down to the way that we support and evaluate. So one of the things I wanted to talk about next was conditions. What I might do is go through the rest of the story, and then we can have a nice chat at the end, just to make sure that we get through. So we've talked about how to demonstrate the learning, but there are conditions of demonstration as well that support and constrain that demonstration. One of them is teaching, I think, and one of them is actually encountering the students, engaging with them. So in Jenny's example, you can help students more or less with the articulation of their understanding process. So you can have a conversation, and in that conversation you can prompt the student where necessary, so that you don't expect them to be able to do the whole thing in one go. For example, you can kind of go, okay, I'll ask you another question, I'll ask you another question, and lead them through the articulation of the process. You can do group work, you can collaborate with them. So those are kind of supportive and constraining conditions. Exams are interesting because if it's a multiple choice question, it constrains the type of answers that you can give, but it also supports the giving of answers by giving you options. So through the conditions, you more closely target a particular type of learning. The conditions narrow the demonstration of learning, if you like, along certain lines, and they need to be judged in relation to the context that you're in, the level that you're at, the goals that you've got. And sometimes they're about what you need in order to feel confident the demonstration indicates the targeted learning. So an easy example of that is invigilated exams. I'm confident that this demonstrates the learning that I want because I know that they couldn't use material resources or other people, but they might also be observation, or they might also be sampling performance over a long period of time so that I can see them in different situations and be more confident. We also evaluate via proxies. So I think that you're always looking at products, processes, performances, and practices, and then those have different possibilities for generating evidence and different possibilities for evaluation. And the thing that matters here is not what the student does, but what you evaluate. So the student might do a project, or they might write an essay, and they go through a process and they perform certain skills in the doing of that essay, and they enact certain essay writing and study practices, but you probably evaluate the essay, which is a product. And that means you cannot actually see the process, you can't see the performance, you're not evaluating those things, you're evaluating the final product, which is great because it's portable, it's easy, but it does not demonstrate some of the types of learning that you might be able to see through those other proxies. So it's interesting, I think, to think, okay, what proxies do you evaluate, and are they the right proxies for the type of learning that you want to target? So does an exam script actually target what you want? So for example, it's a product. We talk about people performing in exam conditions, but the thing that's evaluated is an exam script, it's a product. So you care about the performance conditions, you care about the process that they go through in an exam because you don't want them to use external resources or materials, for example, or people, but you don't evaluate those things. You just constrain them, and then you evaluate the product, which you infer to hold certain properties because of the conditions that you put on the process and the performance. So I encourage you to have a think about the learning that you want to target and think, can that learning actually be evidenced through the proxies that I'm evaluating, or do I need to evaluate other proxies or multiple proxies? Do I need to combine the evaluation of process and product? And if so, how do I do that? Another important consideration is whether you want to evaluate snapshots of capability and learning or sustained engagement. So for example, if you just assess at the end of a course, then it's probably a snapshot assessment of what they can do. If you assess them at multiple times over the course in different ways, then you might be able to see a little bit more of the sustained engagement, the process of learning over time. And sustained engagement reduces the burden that you might have on any given assessment by distributing the evaluation over more data points, if you like. And I think a good way to do that is to rethink student encounters that already exist in your course. So hopefully you are teaching in such a way that you are actually encountering your students, you are interacting with them, they are doing things, and you're giving them feedback. Now, those student encounters are moments of assessment already if you are thinking about how your student's learning is going and if you are giving guidance on them. So I'm encouraging you here to think, what student encounters exist that you could make use of? How could you use those existing student encounters that are just part of teaching, I'm hoping, to generate evidence of learning? Think of examples where you know that your students know something from some way, and think about how you could make more use of this. So how could you make more of the existing encounters, and how could you introduce new encounters that generate the type of evidence of the targeted learning that you want to see? And how can you capture those? So example might be in a portfolio, in some kind of incremental task where you see them writing an essay over time. So you're not just marking the essay, but you are also checking in how they're going with the essay over time, seeing some of the evidence of learning through those encounters in the writing of that essay. So the attention here is the tension between teaching and assessment. Some people want to see assessment as separate from teaching. They want assessment to be an objective measure of what students know that is independent of teaching. And I'm actually arguing for merging the two things, using the natural assessment that happens as part of good teaching, because in good teaching, you get a sense of what your students know, you interact with that. But one of the risks is that you're assessing all the time, and so you're creating a sort of atmosphere of performativity. So the important thing here is to think about how you can still create space for students to explore without worrying about it damaging marks, for example, how you can create space for students and teachers to make mistakes. So an option here, which I think also gets to how we can make sense of different information over time, is sampling. Don't assess everything, but think of a sample where you look at different proxies over time that demonstrate different kinds of learning. And maybe get your students involved in sampling, get them to help curate some examples of the demonstration of the learning over time. Yasa, did you want to come in just quickly?
Yeah, one of the main kind of ways that I found very valuable when doing like assessments of, the kind of connection that students are making is like doing something for the community. And then when they are doing like a project, instead of like doing a PowerPoint project where it's prototype, why not do something for your community? And then you're modeling something for the common good, but at the same time, I'm able to assess a real valuable uh, s- uh, um, perspective that you're putting into something. And that something is coming into terms with you as an existing part of the universe and you as an existing part of your society. So I really love also the different sort of uh uh point that you mentioned here about the assessing the snapshot versus assessing uh the whole kind of time that you spent with your students, and in relation to being performative or valuable. So I just wanted to also put that into perspective here.
Thank you. And I think that's a great idea. So rich assessments, like where you're doing something for community or you're creating some sort of authentic thing, I think are great, because I think that they are opportunities to demonstrate the type of learning that we apparently care about in higher education. The trick is that we need a bit of bravery here, a bit of courage to evaluate those things in relation to our learning outcomes, which is a challenge, right? It's difficult to just use a standard rubric for something that we can't really fully control or predict. But I think that kind of bravery is part of what we need, and it is mitigated by this kind of sampling where we take a whole lot of things that the students do and we evaluate them holistically. So evaluating as we go, I think, is a good thing, because otherwise we are evaluating as we go anyway, I'm hoping, because we're thinking about students learning over time, and we can see, we want to be able to see progress. We want to use this approach to kind of track their progress. And we also want them to not be surprised at the end by the result that they get. We want them to kind of have a sense of where they're at, and we don't want to have a huge burden at the end. I also think that we need a way of aggregating or synthesizing all of the evidence that we're collecting. And my view is aggregation is not as good as holistic synthesis. We want to look across everything they did and not just add the scores up, but think of it as a whole and think, okay, to what extent did that demonstrate the type of learning that we cared about, and how might we create a picture of that whole thing? And that's bravery as well, because that's quite a challenging and difficult to standardize thing. I'm not hugely in favor of standardization, but I realize that's also contentious. So we kind of need to think, how can we do holistic evaluation that will satisfy the different stakeholders that are involved? So the last thing I wanted to do was, can we write down some homework for ourselves on what could you produce that looked at these kinds of issues and share with the group. I'm happy to have a look at stuff that people make if you want to send it to me. Not that I'm not claiming to be the teacher in this respect, but I am a collegial peer. So if you want to send me any thoughts, I'm really happy to look at them. I'll stick my email in the chat. And we just have a couple of minutes for any last questions or thoughts as well.
I know, Tim, that this might be worth having a full session on its own, but I want to hear your own perspective on inclusive assessment, particularly inclusive as being. I'll just mention what my expertise lies in, which is disability rights and inclusion as in presence of people with disabilities in classrooms in higher ed institutions. So how would you view that kind of essence of making learning visible for inclusive classroom in the time of GenAI?
I think it's a great question. Yes, I think it's sort of a fundamental principle in that if you, I try not to treat inclusivity as a separate thing that you do the main assessment and then you sort of make it inclusive, but that you try to think about this in a way that allows a whole, divergent demonstrations of learning, as long as they demonstrate the kind of learning that we are caring about. And I think part of that is opening things up. So if you can sample different types of demonstrations over a longer period of time, you give people more opportunities to demonstrate them in different ways. And you give more opportunities for scaffolding. So I'm not of the school of thought that you shouldn't really help students with their assessment, because I think that is actually our job as educators, is to try and help students do as well as they can in their assessment, as long as the assessment is valid and does demonstrate that they're able to do what we're trying to get them to do. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I want people to have as much opportunity to demonstrate the targeted learning as we can give them.
It's now bang on 11 o'clock, and I actually think that would be a fantastic thing to end on. The idea that it's not about assessment. The assessment isn't about the assessment, it's about demonstrating the targeted learning, and that means some things might need to change. I wanted to give you a moment, Tim, if you had any final thoughts, or if anyone wanted to add anything in the chat, but also I know sometimes people have to drop off or leave, and things like that. So it is 11. Is there anything else anyone wants to add, or Tim wants to add?
Just that, thank you for the opportunity to talk through this with you and test out some thoughts. And I hope that you found it useful, or at least gave you some food for thought.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you
Thank you,
so
everybody
much.
who joined us.
Thank you, everyone. I thought it was wonderful, Tim, so thank you so much.